welcome back. So in this episode, we're going to be fixing one small issue that I've noticed. We can see Stella's text here. The text is very easy to read, and then once Raylene starts speaking, it's very small. And this is not because the font changes size. As we can see, the font for Raylene is 18, she speaks, it's 18. Go to Stella, it's still 18. It's because of the font that's being used. So the font size remains the same, but the font has smaller characters. So for different characters that use a different font, I may want to use a different font size for those particular characters. So let's add the ability to do that. That way, Raylene's text will be a little bigger and easier to read. For this to happen, we need to edit what is available in our character configuration asset. So let's open up the character config data. In here, we've got the name and all these customizations. So let's go ahead and add a public float for the dialogue size. So we'll make the font size. And maybe we could do this for the name font, as well as the public float for the dialogue font size. Okay, and of course when we create a copy, we need to make sure that we save the copy for this character. So dialogue font size is going to equal the dialogue font size, and we'll do the same for the name font size. That's going to equal the cloned name font size. And when we create a default asset, we also need to do that down below. So result.dialogue font size equals some kind of default. So how about we configure a default font size, not in the character config data, but in our dialog system configuration. Let's go to our core scriptable objects and open up the dialog system configuration. In here, we have references to a couple assets or variables that can be referenced by other scripts, and this controls the default configuration for our visual novel. So let's go ahead and add in a public float for the default dialogue font size, and that's going to be equal to 18. And we'll also want one for the name. So this one's going to be I erased the wrong part and killed myself there. Default name font size is going to be 22, as that matches the name font in my scene. So when we create a new dialogue font size here, we're going to go ahead and snag it from that configuration asset. So we'll take the dialogue system .instance .config .default dialogue font size, and we'll do the same for the name font size. So this way, when we generate new characters, they're going to have the default font size if we don't define one within the character configuration asset. Just so we don't wind up with things having 0 as their default font size. We need a reference. So that'll take care of that. So in our character configuration asset, I've gone ahead and made 22 and 18 the default for all of these characters. And this means in our dialogue system, now we can apply the font for each of these characters in case it's something different. So when we come down to apply speaker data to dialogue container, we go ahead and set the color and the font of the name and the dialogue. Let's go ahead and set the size as well. So let's just go ahead and make a new function for that. This will be inside of our dialogue container. And that's simply going to be set dialogue font size, taking in a float for the size, and applying that to the font size of the dialogue text. And we'll do the same thing for our name container. Set name font size, taking in that float and applying it to the name text font size. And then we can just tack on those two commands inside of this function to apply it to the dialogue container. And that means if I go ahead and set Stella as the default 18, but Raylene as 30 for her dialogue, then it scales up and it's much easier to read. This entirely depends on the fonts that you're using. And if we wanted to, we could add a dialogue font scale to our configuration asset that can also change all of the dialogue globally. And so when we apply the dialogue to the screen, we can multiply the dialogue font size for the character by the configuration's dialogue font scale. This means that if we decide to change our font scale to 2, our dialogue will be much larger. Or we could have it 0.7, and then it will be a little smaller. So this will allow customization in the future. If you don't like the idea of having to configure the font size manually for each character by referencing the actual font size, you can do a font scale instead, which will scale in accordance with the values defined in the configuration asset. So you only need to define one for the characters to use the default value. Just make sure that you make those correct changes and set the defaults to 1, so that way they use the default scale. And that means when you apply the value in the dialog system, you'd calculate the font size as the dialog configuration default dialog font size times the configuration's font scale, which could be changed through the settings menu, times the dialog font scale for the particular character. And the same thing for the name of that character, only we would just be using the default name font size from the configuration asset of the visual novel and the character's default font scale. Which means instead of trying to get an exact value, I can just say that Raylene's dialog font scale is 75% larger than Stella's, by saying 1.75. And that should translate into a good size by taking into account the size of the dialog font scale and the default dialog font size of 18. And now we can easily read her text.
Yeah.